How are you guys? So this is a video on how Australia was designed to be rich. And to understand that, we have to go back to 1901 when Australia was founded, and there was a bunch of constitutional conventions and all that. And okay, let's give it a bit more context. But so first of all, Australia is an amazing country. Like Australia is bizarrely good. Like I knew Australia was alright. I knew Australia was good. I've lived in Canada, UK, France, Italy, Brazil. I've lived around. I've been to 40 countries. Australia is amazing. Like Australia is really well built. There's very little poverty. There's problems. There's problems everywhere. It's been getting worse. It's been getting worse everywhere. But overall, it's an amazing country. And any metric you see will corroborate with that. If you see HDI, if you see life expectancy, if you see GDP per capita, if you see average wages, minimum wage, everything. Just Australia is a good country. Now, why is Australia a good country? Uh, isn't it just like a desert far from everything in the middle of nowhere? Yes, it is a desert and far in the middle of nowhere, like far from everything. But first of all, Australia has like a very lucky set of minerals that it sells that kind of helps like the economy a lot. Um, I don't think, and I've said that in other videos, I don't think that that's the main reason why Australia is rich. Because if everyone that has like natural resources were rich, then a bunch of countries in Africa would be rich, Venezuela would be rich, Brazil would be rich, and it's just not the case. Like there are some countries that have a lot of natural resources that are rich. There's some countries that have a lot of natural resources and are poor, and then also there's some countries that don't have any natural resources and are incredibly rich. Japan is an example. Switzerland is an example. Denmark is an example. So there's plenty of things to choose from. Going back to 1901, Australia founders were really smart because they could really pick and choose. Like they're really lucky because Australia is such a young country that, like, even when Australia was formed, even America was already over 100 years old, and America is also like a young country in certain perspectives. And so Australia had the opportunity to really look out, see what was working, and try to make an Australian version of everything, you know. And so it looked at the U.S. and it saw that the Senate was a good idea. That having two different houses of legislation that are elected differently makes for a much more sound and not respecting, but like a much more sound and nuanced political system. Because one drastic change in one house doesn't necessarily mean that a bunch of crazy laws get approved immediately. Like it, political process becomes a little more gradual, and so they really like that. They got the Senate out of the past British colonies. Australia is pretty much the only one with a strong upper house like the Senate. Canada doesn't really have a strong upper house. New Zealand, I don't even know if they have an upper house at all. And England itself, they have the House of Lords, but how strong is the House of Lords nowadays, really? Ireland also is pretty much just for show. So Australia, they were like, no, we're gonna go after the U.S. with that one. Another thing they took from the U.S. is federalism, which is absolutely genius, really. Like that's probably the one thing the U.S. got the most right. And so in Australia, weed, for example, is legal in ACT but not in Victoria. There's different rules, there's different governments, and things and legislation is generally, especially education. Education is very decentralized, and so Australia really took that after the U.S., after Switzerland as well. If you come to Melbourne, there'll be like a bunch of different town halls because it isn't just Melbourne; it's a bunch of different cities or different electorates and all that vote for like a very local council that kind of solves their own problems, you know, with regards to like streets and uh, parks and schools and all that. And obviously that works really, really well. So that's something that Australia took after the US and Switzerland much more than, let's say, the UK. The UK is overall much more centralized on average. But it also looked at the US presidential system and it was like, well, that's kind of problematic because like if you have a House and a Senate that go one way and a president that goes another way, then the legislative and the executive are like at odds and they can't really agree on anything, and then you're not governed for 4 years. So that isn't really good. And it looked at the British system, and the British system obviously has it's parliamentary, so whomever holds a majority in the lower house also has the executive pretty much by default through the prime minister. And so Australia took that after England, which makes for much more cohesive government, because then you have an executive that's kind of in line with the legislative, but you still have the Senate, which could be against the government. So you still have some friction and some room for compromise, but like not as much as there would need, for example, in the U.S. Um, it also took, obviously, from the UK the figure of the monarch, which you might like it or not, but it does depolitize people a lot. And if you compare like Australia with like the U.S., Australians do not care half as much about politics as people in the U.S. or even people in Switzerland, for that matter, and so or even people in the UK. And so they've managed to put themselves away from politics, and that might be or might not be one of the reasons, but they took that after the UK as well. Um, and they also took some things after Switzerland, and what they took after Switzerland, besides federalism, like also from the US, they took Switzerland's constitutional amendment procedure, which is over half of all the states and over half of the population have to agree on certain things. So, like, to change the constitution, if 80% of people vote in favor of it, but not more than half of the states vote for it as well. Like, people in half the states don't vote for it as well. Like, let's say everyone in Victoria, everyone in New South Wales votes in favor of some sort of change, but everyone else votes against it, let's say, or even everyone in Queensland votes for it as well. Since it's only like 3 states, even if it's like 60-70% of the population, it's not going to get passed. And it's kind of better than the U.S. constitutional amendment procedure, because in the U.S., like, the Constitution isn't amendable. Like, it's impossible to amend the Constitution pretty much, especially nowadays. And so, like, there are amendments and all that, but like, it's really, really hard, which kind of forces the Supreme Court to like vote on weird things that they kind of have to like kind of modernize the Constitution. And so there's a lot of subjectivity involved, which, well, in Australia and Switzerland, they definitely could avoid that. And obviously then also Australia, like I said, they took the best out of all those systems and they sprinkled some things of their own. One thing, for example, is Australians have virtually no rights, which is very interesting, because a Bill of Rights and the U.S. form, like in the U.S. form, it's like 10, 15 enumerated rights very explicitly, and it's like those are rights that are very important, and so we have to protect them, so the government doesn't take them away from you. And that's interesting. Switzerland has a little bit of a different approach. Like, Switzerland has a much more comprehensive sets of rights. Like, in the Swiss constitution, you're going to see a right to affordable health care and a right to education and lots of different rights. Let's call it that. I don't like the Swiss model that much. I think it's like you afford people rights, and it's like, okay, but that doesn't mean anything. Like, every right comes with a responsibility. It would be much more reasonable for each canton to just decide on the rights it wants to afford its citizens, let's say. But alright, whatever, we're not talking about that. The thing is, like, if you enumerate rights, it doesn't actually mean that they're being respected. Like, the Soviet Union had the right to freedom of speech and the right to, I don't know, food, and the right to healthcare, and the right to a bunch of different things that obviously it didn't afford, or quite contrary. In many cases, the government persecuted people for saying things and all that. So having something written down doesn't mean that it's going to be protected. And so I prefer the US model over the Swiss model, but Australia, they have their own model where I think there's like 4 rights or 3 rights in the Constitution. It's like the right to vote and 2 other rights, and that's it. Like, it's very, very limited. And one thing that wasn't created at the time, but that Australia ended up adapting, which I absolutely love, is it adapted a much. It took after a much better voting system. Let's call it that way, where contrary to the UK, contrary to America, even contrary to Switzerland, I think it's much more representative, and so it works differently for the House and for the Senate. But for the House, it's a uh, single, not single candidate, but winner takes all, let's say, kind of system, uh, which incentivizes more of a two-party system, which makes sense because in the lower house, having a majority is really important, so you can actually govern. And so, if you look at the lower house and the upper house, what normally happens in Australia is the lower house has mostly like the two biggest coalitions, like kind of competing, and one of them forms a majority, and then they get the executive government. But then Senate, they took after the U.S. as well in the Senate, where it's gradually elected. So every 3 years, only half the Senate is up for re-election, and if you're elected, you're up for 6 years. So that's interesting as well. It makes so political change is gradual, which is a very good principle overall in politics. But one thing that they did that was very not very Australian, but like it was very unique, let's call it, is for the Senate they wanted to incentivize smaller parties, and so what they did is they have bigger electorates that elect like more than one candidate, and those candidates are elected through like a preferential system, and that is like, well, to be fair, the lower house is also ranked through a preferential system, which is great. But the upper house, you rank preferential system, and there's more than one winner, which means that there's more room for second and third, like third place parties to actually have a say. And so you end up with a very representative, very proportional, very just overall rounded up kind of system, and it shows. In the 120 years since Australia was founded, it got rich, and then it got richer, and then it got richer, and more people came, and it's still a very sound, very efficient government. Australia is not a country with not a lot of rules. Like there's a lot of rules, but, like the rules work. Like the rules, they really, really, really work, and um, yeah, it's just like I live here right now. I don't know how long I'll live here. Like saying all this, but I don't know if I want to move to Australia permanently or anything. But it goes to show that like uh, some good decisions that you've made in the long past just still affect like the country's population 100 years into the future, and it kind of doesn't guarantee them, but it provides a lot for them, let's say. And what I just said in this video, I think 95% of Australians don't even know most of that. I might have made one or two mistakes also, so don't quote me on anything. Go do your own research. I'm not even Australian. I'm not a political scientist. I'm just like a random 24-year-old dude. But like most Australians don't even know that, and so like they don't even know why they're rich, and that means that they can't protect what made them rich. That means they can't like value the systems that are in place right now that are making them rich and protected and wealthy and efficient and safe. And that's problematic because, well, if you don't even know you have something valuable, it's only a matter of time before someone steals it from you, you know. And believe me, there's people who would change it in a heartbeat. They would change it in a heartbeat, even though it's worked so well for 120 years. And so, yeah, I wanted to make this video, kind of rebutting some of the things I think are kind of wrong, and talking about Australia. So I hope you guys liked it, and I'll see you guys next time.